I want to focus on Paddy's role and involvement in the Gandhi Development Trust. He was part and parcel of it since its inception. He was a founder member of the Gandhi Development Trust and its sister organization, Satyagraha in Pursuit of Truth. Both of these organizations were established in the aftermath of the first democratic elections in our country, and they were born out of the need to contribute to the building of a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and peaceful South Africa. Now, let me go back to Paddy. Although Paddy was quiet and deceptively mild, he was solid to the core, and he carried through whatever was started with dedication. We saw this in GDT, and it is no surprise that he was closely involved in monitoring these programs, all of which are values-based and seek to instill important values in young people in particular. Paddy died suddenly on the afternoon of Friday, the 23rd of November, 2018. And in his 76 years, he was a tireless activist for the poor, the marginalized, for interfaith partnership, social cohesion, and peace. This year would have seen Paddy turning 80, but obviously it was not meant to be. However, this memorial lecture in celebration of his 80th birth anniversary serves to honor him and his selfless contribution to our society. And who better to pay this tribute than another stalwart, cast in the same mold, who worked with Paddy and was also given his life to the cause of freedom, democracy, and peace in South Africa. Pravin Gordhan has been actively involved in the anti-apartheid struggle from his student days in the 1970s, when he was an organizer in the student movement, and in the 1980s, when he played a prominent role in civic and political work, including work in the Durban Housing Action Committee, the Natal Indian Congress, and the UDF. He qualified in 1974 as a pharmacist, working at the King Edward VIII Hospital until he was expelled by the administration in 1981 for his political involvement.
Because he had TB too.
He had TB as well, and we know how he got that. He spent 4 years underground in the 1980s and became deeply involved in the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress. He played a pivotal role in South Africa's transition in the multi-party talks at the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, and he was co-chair of the Transitional Executive Council. He chaired the Constitutional Committee, that constitution that we have today, and this committee had oversight over the implementation of the new constitution adopted by our parliament in May 1996. He continued to serve actively as an ANC Member of Parliament until March 1998, when he joined the South African Revenue Services as Deputy Commissioner. He was appointed as Commissioner in November 1999 and spent a decade building the South African Revenue Services into a formidable tax and customs administration recognized worldwide for its efforts in enabling the South African government to collect the resources it needed for our development programs. In May 2009, in the midst of the global financial crisis and a worldwide recession, he was appointed as Minister of Finance and acquired a challenging task of navigating the domestic economy out of turbulence towards fiscal stability and a new growth path. In May 2014, he was appointed as Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, only to be reappointed to the finance portfolio in December 2015. I think we all know about this one. He remained the Minister of Finance until he was inexplicably recalled at around midnight on the 30th of March 2017. He then served as a Member of Parliament and became part of the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises and was appointed as Minister of Public Enterprises by President Ramaphosa. It's a portfolio that has proven to be a real hot potato, but one that is very much up to the task of getting. This department performs shareholder oversight on behalf of government over various state-owned companies, including Transnet, Eskom, as we all know, Denel, SAA, and the like. He currently serves as a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, having been elected in December 2012. Pravin Gordhan is passionate about democracy, racial and gender equality, and working towards building a prosperous future for all in South Africa. He is straight talking and does not tolerate corruption, wrongdoing, and malfeasance. This has rendered him particularly unpopular in some quarters, as evidenced by the refrain of addressing him as, quote, Jamnadas, unquote. He can also take credit for making join the dots one of the most commonly used expressions when referring to corruption in South Africa. Let us warmly welcome Pravin Gordhan, who will address us from the virtual platform.
Good afternoon, Sanbonani, Assalamu alaikum, Namaskar. Thank you very much for this honor and privilege of delivering the fourth Paddy Kearney Lecture. I have had the privilege of knowing Paddy and working with him for some 40 years. Like all of you, I remember him as a person of humility, quiet fortitude, immense resolve, and creativity in the midst of oppression and racial discrimination. These were years during which activists rebuilt democratic, mass-based organizations, and the names of Archbishop Hurley, Reverend Lundu, Reverend Reuben Phillips were synonymous with moral and spiritual courage and solidarity with the struggles of workers, communities, youth, women, and Democrats from all walks of life. It was also a time of building institutions like the Diaconia Council of Churches, nascent trade union formations that were formed at that building, women's organizations like the Natal Organization of Women, community-based organizations in the Montville, Merebank, Phoenix, Sambanati, Kwandangezi, and Newlands East. It was a time during which the growth of a new political consciousness based on the values of black consciousness, non-racialism, non-sexism, religious fraternity, and human rights was generated. All of these formed within the embrace of the Freedom Charter. Above all, the activism across all the different terrains was based on a deep-seated, non-negotiable, and vehement opposition to apartheid, to Bantustans, to the tricameral parliament, and an equally resilient belief in and determination to create a democratic South Africa without any vestige of the apartheid era. Paddy's humble, quiet, yet steely demeanor was reinforced by remarkable social and institutional entrepreneurship. He was able to find or create the bridge between his own spirituality and the political and social context and dynamics of the different periods that his life traversed. At each period and sector presented its own idiosyncratic challenges and needs. Paddy was indeed, in Robert Bolt's words, a man for all seasons. Many are the lessons that the work and life of Paddy Kearney has to offer to us all, the younger generation in particular. Amongst them is how do we understand the complex world that we live in today. Achieving the goal of a democratic, just, and fair world has become much more challenging for progressive activists and organizations. The COVID pandemic, climate change, war, geopolitical tensions, the contest for economic and technological hegemony have wreaked havoc across societies, in particular on the billions of working class and poor across both the developed and developing world. These factors have exacerbated inequality, poverty, racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and the worst of inhuman conduct. Add to this the dilution of democratic values, the undermining of democratic institutions, some even call it democratic coups, a vile populism that evokes the worst of human behavior, and the role of fake news and the digital media, which create the toxicity of the kind of situation we find ourselves in. Equally, rampant greed, elite capture of politics, and the uncontrolled avarice and extraction of rent tears apart the current capitalist model and its sustainability. As John Kenneth Galbraith said many years ago, and I quote, "This yet again is a time of private wealth and public misery. It is in times like these that there must be, on the one hand, an ability to decode and grasp the new dynamics at play, and at the same time, a set of core values and principles must guide us both in theory and in action. So what does it mean to be progressive and caring Democrats in the 21st century? The new dynamics, both across the world and in South Africa, must increase our resolve to sustain and put into action our progressive values, values of building inclusive democratic institutions, social justice, which must be at the center of progressive values, hold public representatives and public servants accountable, enhance social cohesion and a common nationhood, strive for economic justice and a fair sharing of wealth and resources and the creation of decent jobs, extend the social safety net for those who need it, combat corruption, rent-seeking and cronyism, which undermine all of our efforts to create a better world. Fight racism, sectarianism, tribalism, misogyny, and all the other ills that befall our societies. And above all, do not compromise on non-racialism and non-sexism as important constitutional values of modern-day South Africa. The path to these goals will be unpredictable, rough, and highly contested, but the vision that drives us must not be diluted, whatever the resistance from vested interests and opportunists of all sorts. New contexts and new dynamics, of course, require new paradigms within which to understand them. So there are also a new set of imperatives which we need to interpret with an appropriate set of tools, which will help to develop a new paradigm for the achievement of social justice in the 21st century. This new paradigm must respond to, amongst others, a very different capitalism which eliminates massive inequality, marginalization, and exclusion both within a society and across the world. A fairer globalization, and above all, a new set of trade rules for a new global dynamic, a just climate transition, a society-wide climate action plan, which particularly KwaZulu-Natal, from its recent experiences, will bear testimony to. A profound and fundamental change in the economy, which must be far less exploitative and far more inclusive. A program to combat reactionary populism and fake news. From economic extraction, we must move to investment for the many. Reinforce the role of women in society and economy, and prepare the youth of today for a new and very different world of tomorrow. A crucial part of a progressive project is the recognition, as Minouche Shafiq of the London School of Economics puts it, the social contract has failed. That is, and I quote, the partnership between individuals, businesses, civil society, and the state to contribute to a system in which there are collective benefits has not worked. Among those collective benefits, as Amartya Sen sees it, is that the social contract should aim not just to meet people's needs, but to improve the capabilities of every citizen to achieve the kind of life that they value. Shafiq, of course, goes further to indicate that, and I quote, the rise of populism, the backlash against globalization and technology, the economic aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, and the coronavirus pandemic, the culture wars around race and women's roles in society, and the youth protests about climate change are bellwethers that a new social contract is needed, end of quotation. This applies to Britain, this applies to most of the world, and certainly applies to South Africa. It is in this context that we remember Paddy as a man of conscience. And I quote here Thomas More as reflected in the play by Robert Bolt. And that in matters of conscience, the loyal subject is more bounden of his conscience than to any other being. In a world that is driven by great acquisition and economic extraction, in a world and country in which corruption is rife, often at the expense of the poor and the unemployed, the challenge certainly is, can we develop a value-driven conscience which must be stronger than the power of greed and corruption? Paddy Kearney was certainly an activist for all seasons. And here I quote Martin Luther King: "Only through an inner spiritual transformation do we gain the strength to fight vigorously the evils of the world in humble and loving spirit. The transformed nonconformist, moreover, never uses the passive sort of patience as an exercise to do nothing." End of quotation. Paddy's democratic activism transitioned through so many different periods of our history. The repressive climate of the 70s and late 80s, the mass struggles and open campaigns of the late 70s and early 80s, the transition to democracy of the early 90s, and the past two decades of consolidating democracy and combating the capture of the state and entrenching corruption. His unique ability to combine this spiritual transformation and beliefs with a remarkable activism and non-conformism, as Martin Luther King indicates, enabled him to embrace interfaith and non-racial inclusivity. The challenge for us, in a context where social and political mobilization sinks to new and worrying levels of narrowness and chauvinism, is how do Democrats keep the flames of liberation alive, of social cohesion alive, of social justice and temperance alive? Paddy would expect that no injustice should go unchallenged. And how do we commit ourselves to such an ethos? Perhaps we need to seek inspiration from Chief Albert Luthuli. And I quote when he says, "What the future has in store for me, I do not know. It might be ridicule, imprisonment, a concentration camp, flogging, banishment, and even death. I only pray to the Almighty to strengthen my resolve so that none of these grim possibilities may deter me from striving for the sake of the good name of our beloved country to make it a true democracy and a true union in form and spirit of all communities in the land. My only painful concern at times is for the welfare of my family," he says. "But I try, even in this regard, in a spirit of trust and surrender to God's will, as I see it, to say, God will provide." It is inevitable, he says, that in working for freedom, some individuals and some families have to take the lead and suffer. The road to freedom is via the cross. End of quotation. Such is the testimony of a tried leader who indeed suffered at the hands of the apartheid regime and whose thoughts nonetheless provide inspiration and leadership today. Whilst the many challenges seem foreboding, Paddy's life and work were driven by a deep faith in his spirituality, his refusal to lose hope, and a formidable yet quiet resilience in action. As Father Albert Nolan, whom I knew many years ago, said in a quotation which indicates strengthened in one's choice by solidarity with others in struggle, Father Nolan addresses the question of how one might draw strength in carrying out one's commitment. He associates the notion of liberation struggle with the ideas of hope of a solution. He notes the importance of singing and dancing and remarks that they are also a celebration of solidarity or unity in struggle. The struggle rescues people, he says, from alienation isolation, and individualism. It restores Ubuntu, or humanness, and the experience of being a living member of a living body. Hence the slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. Let us be inspired by these words and clarity of vision about a better South Africa and a better world, a resilient conscience that guides us in moments of doubt, and an uncompromised belief in social justice for all. Like Paddy, we will know that our individual lives will traverse and wade through endless waves of struggle, but not in vain. New milestones will be achieved. At the same time, there will be setbacks. Such is the nature of history. But our progressive values, our conscience, our resolve to constantly improve the world around us will help us to deal with new contingencies and realities as we continue our march to a just, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa, which belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Paddy's message to progressive Democrats, and indeed all South Africans, will surely be that we must mobilize more and more people into democratic activism, that we must constantly deepen the awareness of democratic values among all communities and empower them with information that will enable them to make the right choices, that we must build social cohesion, religious unity in diversity as we work through our communities and different sectors, that we must build institutions and organizations of civil society and engage in action and mobilize for action in support of just causes. This is reflected in a speech by Albert Luthuli once again in the 44th Congress of the ANC in 1955, when he exhorts the members to be willing to serve and sacrifice, and I quote, "But for all this, we cannot claim to have prosecuted our campaigns with any semblance of military efficiency and technique. We cannot say that the Africans are accepting fast enough the gospel of service and sacrifice for the general and large good without expecting personal and that immediate reward. They have not accepted fully the basic truth enshrined in the saying, no cross, no crown," end of quotation. That there shall not be any reward, he says, without the necessary sacrifices that we make, not only for ourselves, but for the wider community. Ultimately, we are all subject to what Gandhi says, that nonviolence is not a garment to be put on and off at will. Similarly, social justice is not a garment to be put on and off at will. He goes on to say its seat is in the heart, and it must be an inseparable part of our being. Ultimately, all of us, like Gandhi himself professed, will be judged, as he said, by my actions. And we will be judged by posterity, by what we do today and tomorrow to ensure that South Africans and indeed humanity has a better set of prospects ahead of it than we've had up to this point in time. But more importantly, as we look at the many hurdles that we face today, none of them is insurmountable. If we look at our own history, and if we look at the life and work of Paddy Kearney and many other patriots like him. Once again, thank you very much for this huge honor and opportunity to deliver this lecture. Thank you.
I think 42 years ago, but there was a particular event, and it really sticks in my mind. I'm sure you remember it. It was a meeting of the Health and Housing Committee with Durban Housing Action Committee, and I think DAC were pushing for information from the city, and the city didn't want to give the information. and we had Mr. Wolfstone, who was the Deputy City Treasurer there, and you said to him, Mr. Stone, I want to remind you that you are my servant because you are a civil servant. At which point Mr. Stone got very, very angry and stormed out of the room. But it's a really interesting idea. I mean, at that time, it was, I think, intolerable for him to hear that because of the racial dynamics of the time. But it's the idea of, and I mean, this is posed to you not in a, are you still a servant? Or do you see yourself as a servant? But how do you now understand that? And how do you understand the relationship now between government and people in relation to that comment?
I'm glad you can remember what happened 42 years ago. That was an interesting time, ladies and gentlemen, and comrades and friends, when we were excluded from voting, but that didn't stop us from either barging into City Hall or into those committee rooms, which I remember very well. And it was a time when there were a few people like Crispin who had joined the City Council. I think it was called the Progressive Party then. And we had somewhat of an understanding that we could do things differently at the time. But to get to the key point of your question, whether you are a government civil servant or whether you are a government so-called political office bearer, in today's terms, democracy and its rules require that we hold ourselves open to accountability, that our salaries are indeed, just like Mr. Stone, paid for by taxpayers and ratepayers, depending on what office we hold. And at the end of the day, we all have to be seen to be contributing to the public good in whatever way we can. Of course, nobody at that stage anticipated things like state capture and all the torment that goes with that, particularly in the period that we had, as a country, had to go through. But nonetheless, we are on a different path now. But the roots of accountability and the consciousness about accountability is something that must still embed itself, because there is still the tendency, as I indicate in the lecture, that people want to climb into public office for their own personal benefits and for their own personal pockets, not only to earn the check at the end of the month, but to also curry favor with the necessary people and processes so that they can get more than just a check at the end of the month or the end of the year or whatever the case might be. And in that sense, the if you like, the obligation to be more accountable, the obligation to actually get this consciousness going, that we are public servants in the broadest sense of the word, is something that is still work in progress in our country. And it involves a struggle of a different kind now. It's no longer the anti-apartheid struggle, but today it's the anti-fascist struggle. If you take people like Trump into account, it's an anti-elitist struggle because we don't want elites to dominate political and other processes. It's also an anti-poverty and anti-inequality struggle, so that the largest number of people in a country like ours see a qualitative and a quantitative change in their standard of living.
Mr. Teddy has asked, how do we remobilize to make things work?
Well, pretty much as Paddy did during his lifetime, and people like Maggie Govender and others who are present in the room, and yourselves through the Denis Hurley Centre, we all need to get into contact with the grassroots in some way, through whatever mechanism we can see before ourselves as opportunities that are open for such linkages. And above all, we need to reorientate or orientate and educate a new generation of activists who learn what it means to engage in activism, in mobilization, and in organizing for and against certain things within a democratic context. And that still requires progressive activists who are driven by a progressive agenda, at the heart of which is social justice, pretty much that which Paddy reflected in his own life and in his own contribution as well. So whether you come from a religious or church background, whether you are coming from a civic background or even a political background, we need to now invest in a new type of activist, but who is motivated by the same set of values of accountability, of service, of mobilizing people, of informing them and educating them about the very complex context in which we operate, both within South Africa and indeed in the world as well, and ensure that the beneficiaries of an economy growing or a country progressing are indeed all 60 million people in South Africa.
And what is your message to people who feel let down by government, especially with regard to dealing with corruption?
Well, in respect of the first, there are a vast number of people at all levels within the political and other formations who want to see a better South Africa, who want to contribute to this in a very active way, and who are fighting against tremendous odds at the moment, because we have very negative media narratives. And for those of you that are swift with your thumbs and are on Twitter and other social media, where all sorts of negativity and attacks will be directed at you if you are doing the right things. But the simple answer is the quiet majority is still a democratic majority. The quiet majority is one that still wants to see, like all of you in the room, a better and different South Africa. But as I point out from the Martin Luther King quote, we're not going to get a better South Africa if we merely fold our arms and sit back. We've got to find ways of becoming actively involved and getting more and more people to move out of their armchairs into some form of activism, where the good work and the pressure and the kind of mobilizing that one does is seen to be impacting on the environment in which we find ourselves. The floods in KZN, for example, gave all of us an opportunity, not just a few NGOs and the government side, to become engaged in one way or another, to extend solidarity. And I'm sure many communities were involved in that process. On the corruption side, we live in a democratic society with democratic rules. So none of us is going to go walk around and arrest people. That's left to the police. None of us is able to investigate, although journalists have done a marvelous job, or some journalists, in undertaking investigations that have uncovered all sorts of things. And the recent revelations in relation to Babita Deokaran and her excellent work in the Gauteng administration has at least borne some fruit, with the CEO and CFO of Tembisa Hospital being put on precautionary suspension. So we can certainly contribute at that level. But what we do require is the right kind of skills that can investigate these corruption-related crimes quickly And then we require a national prosecuting authority that makes up its mind more diligently, but also with far greater speed to bring people to account for the fraudulent behavior that they have engaged in as well. So yes, one can be disappointed with government, but I can assure you that from the president down, most of us want to see far speedier action on that front. And the question that we might all want to ask is, how can we also contribute to creating an anti-corruption conscience in society, where bribes are neither paid nor accepted, where business people who are engaging with the state charge a fair price. If one looks at my experience and lessons learned from Eskom, for example, there's so much of theft of public funds. It's unbelievable. Oil that is supposed to be delivered is not delivered but paid for, and 100,000 liters at a time. Coal, which is supposed to be of a particular quality, is mixed with rubbish, and metal and delivered to power stations, but you pay the normal price, so of somewhere between 450 rands and 900 rands per ton. But because the coal price globally has been climbing to $300 per ton and above, is far more profitable for people to export their coal and not keep the commitments to Eskom. There are other spare parts and commodities that are for which Eskom is probably paying 20 to 30% more than it should actually pay, because of the syndicates that are operating both inside and outside of Eskom as well. Then nothing stops the public, like yourselves, or through yourselves, being mobilized against people who are engaging in this kind of activity, so that just as much as in the anti-apartheid days, some of you will recall that people who spied for the security police, or people who gave evidence against their own comrades in trials, were isolated in society. People who collaborated with the tricameral parliament and the Bantustan system were also isolated in society. Now, perhaps there are lessons there that we can draw on and begin to isolate, name, and shame people who are engaged in corruption that we are aware of. And in that way, civil society becomes a lot more energized and activated to participate in these processes.
Isn't the new revolution should turn to violence? Because we're dealing with violent people. They killed the whistleblower. What they are doing, in your face they are. When we were fighting against apartheid, we had to turn to violence because that's the language they understand. When you talk peace, this is a violent world. It is not a peaceful world. That's the history of man. So the new revolution has got to be violent because that's the language they understand. Zero tolerance to corruption, especially from leaders who are in these positions, who have wrecked this country up, that everybody knows. Let's not talk this, that. Resort to violence. You cannot say that in your position, but the new generation must claim this country back. And this is how you as a freedom fighter claimed and killed against apartheid. This is what new youth must do. There's no other way.
Yeah, but we live in a different era where there's a new set of rules that are operating, and that is why we call ourselves a democracy. So that's the first point. The second is to do all the things that I've just mentioned earlier on, one doesn't have to be violent. One certainly needs to be active. And thirdly, I think the slogan on zero tolerance against corruption is a valid slogan. But let's, in those days, at midnight and thereafter, we used to put up posters which said, "Don't vote." for the tricameral parliament or whatever the case might be, or distributed in an underground way pamphlets of the ANC and the Communist Party. Now, nothing stops us from putting up posters all over Durban and all over KwaZulu-Natal and all over South Africa, which says, let's fight corruption together and let's isolate people who are in fact corrupt. So without necessarily engaging in violence, there are ways of mobilizing society and activating people to isolate, as I said earlier on, the very people who are engaging A, in corruption, and B, violence against whistleblowers and others. And so there's a lot of space now to do things. The question is, some of us are too old to get involved in some of the physical activity, but we can lead younger people and teach them the tactics of opposition to this kind of conduct in our country. Otherwise, they're going to inherit a terrible South Africa. So all of us who have gray hair or gray beard or bald heads have an obligation before we pass on to ensure that a new generation of democratic activists are produced, and not only just produced, but they develop new techniques of enhancing democracy and resisting all the negative features that you've just described. Thanks very much. It's good to see you, Bala.
My name is Mhlengi, representing an NGO based in Lamontville called Lamontville Thembeletse Care Centre. I'll be speaking on behalf of the new generation, and in your speech you mentioned Mr. Kearney as, or you described Mr. Kearney as a conscious person. And I believe that this is one key element that's missing in today's youth, just to say. Just wondering perhaps if you could share some knowledge and ideas in terms of how we can integrate and perhaps teach the youth about self-consciousness. I believe that it could be perhaps one of the ways we can combat some of the social ills that are happening in today's world. And perhaps with us you can share some knowledge and ideas on how we could start bringing in the youth and teaching them about consciousness.
Well, you come from a township which has a very rich history of organizing, mobilizing, and resistance. So in our time, I'm not sure if the younger generation remembers Jabus Tole, Babat Lamini. You currently have Becky Tere, but he plays a very different role now. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, comrades from Lamontville and indeed Chesterville, a little bit in Claremont, Kwandangezi, organized the Joint Rent Action Committee, whilst activists from the colored and Indian areas eventually organized the Durban Housing Action Committee based on civics in each of those organizations. Those were tough years in which to organize. They were even tougher if one engaged in open non-racial activity. But what does it mean to instill the right consciousness? Well, firstly, we need people like yourselves and the center that you operate from. Secondly, you need to get groups of young people to participate in doing whatever they can, clean Lamontville campaigns or help elderly people to get to the clinic and collect their medication or pensions. And that's a simple way of addressing the day-to-day needs of people in the community. But thirdly, it's to instill an awareness of what is democracy, what are key principles of social justice. And it's by both engaging in the activity I've mentioned or the activity that you might be involved in, organizing a soccer club, for example, or a cricket club, is another way things were done in those days. And linking that to an understanding being obtained about current events, both in the globe and within South Africa itself. In the process, we have to make choices as well about what we think we want to advance as the right things to do and what we want to advance as the wrong things to do. But there are people who are sitting with you who have similar experiences and who can guide you as well. But I'm very glad that you have some kind of institution within Lamontville that can act as a base from which the kind of history that you've had before in the early 1980s, but even before that, you've had Florence Mkhize coming from there. You had Mzizi Dube, who was killed by the security police. And now teach the young people about that rich history of Lamontville and the kind of heroes and heroines that emerged under very difficult circumstances, so that today we can sit in a democratic South Africa. So however tough, difficult and gloomy things might look today, they're a far cry from the kind of period in which those comrades operated and many of us operated as well. So you have a new platform, which is called a Democratic South Africa, but you have a rich history to teach our younger people and which they can learn to emulate in the new context in which they find themselves.
I was asked to welcome you and also to say something about the significant links. Why ICON, the International Centre of Nonviolence, and its connections to Paddy and to the histories that bring us together. So the ICON, the International Centre of Nonviolence, was founded and based at Durban University of Technology, spearheaded by Ila Gandhi, who's of course here with us today. And it was in 2015 we shifted into DUT to become an integral and I think increasingly valued part of Durban University of Technology. And until that time we were led by an advisory board on which Paddy Kearney was a very, very active member. And you know, despite the fact that we don't want to say nice things about him, it was his wisdom and humanity and vision and occasionally great humor that was one of the really valuable elements on a very successful advisory board that headed us up. Central to our work, and this was Ila's vision for us at the beginning, is that we work for nonviolence, but we work in and through education. We work in educational spaces. We focus in particular on what does nonviolence in education look like and feel like. And so specifically what we are now doing, at least Africa-wide and increasingly we're extending beyond Africa. The majority of our students come from other African countries, from Morocco through to Rwanda and Zimbabwe, and we're actually now seeking to increase the number of South African students. We do a lot of undergraduate teaching. We were central to the development of a compulsory module, which all DUT students now take in their first year. But we have specific modules on leadership for nonviolence and a module called Violence and Nonviolence. We are very active in the research and publication area, and we are involved in different forms of community engagement. I mean, one form is links, strong links with universities across Africa where we are helping to launch peace programs. We have one of our staff members currently in the DRC. We've been teaching at the University of Seychelles. Well, other people on the staff, not me yet. Sorry, there's about the resentment. But I hope to go to the Seychelles and teach there. We have a leadership program that we run. We have just started a link to Botanic Gardens, exploring the issue of spaces and nature in relation to our work because of the environmental commitment we have, and a link with WESA in particular to, with regards to our leadership work.
Paddy believed that non-violent education is imperative in bringing about transformation in individuals and the country. And I want to quote what he said in an interview with a Satyagraha journalist. Quote, "All levels of education, preschools, primary and high schools, tertiary institutes, and even in the community and workplace, people need to be exposed to non-violent methods of resolving conflict," unquote. So the GDT's early development, childhood development project is part of the strategy to create a non-violent and socially responsible society based on the principles of Ubuntu. We find increasingly that children are exposed to various forms of violence, both inside and outside the home. They're exposed to abuse, crime, conflict, hunger, poverty, neglect, and environmental threats. And if this is what they see around them, and in the absence of an affirming value system in their early years, there's a strong possibility that they will also model violent, irresponsible, and destructive behavior. So in recognizing the importance of investing in the early years of a child's development, the GDT's project plan is to introduce preschool children to a core set of values, universal values, underpinned by Ubuntu. And there are programs that are being run in relation to this. Then we've got the schools training program, which focuses on developing a culture of non-violence through inculcating human values and awareness of HIV and AIDS, skills in non-violent communication, conflict resolution, and social cohesion. And again, in a society where it seems that violence, intolerance, and conflict are endemic, this education and awareness training program becomes a crucial necessity. The Values in Education program begins in the early childhood development stages and covers grades 8 to 10 at schools and is also run within communities. Then we have one of the key youth programs, the Speech and Essay Contest, which involves schools throughout KwaZulu-Natal. This contest comprises a contest in local neighborhood areas where a host school invites neighboring schools to participate in the first round of the contest. Participants are allowed to speak in English or isiZulu, and a school can enter either or both English and isiZulu speaking contestants. The contest targets grade 7 and grade 10 learners, and schools are allowed to submit one essay in English and one in isiZulu. In the first round, they have to have an internal contest to select the best writer and thinker. Then that writer has to be assisted by the school with the references to literature and in the improvement of his or her writing skills. So many learners benefit from this process, and the GDT encourages schools and learners by offering prizes to both the winning learner and the school.